Welcome to Talk Universe. This is our show for Wednesday, October 12th, 2016. This week I want to say hello to our listeners in the Ukraine. We have quite a number of them that have shown up recently. And tonight we have a show based on something that everybody seems to be interested in, and it's movies and science. We're going to look at how science has changed the way we make movies, particularly the stunts and special effects that go into movies and make them so interesting. And we've got some fascinating things to talk about on the subject. Now, everybody enjoys a good movie, and one of the things that I've seen lately, and I think a lot of people have just accepted it without thinking about it, most movies we see today are rather special effects heavy. Many of the biographies and personal stories don't show that trend, but most of the movies that make the big box office dollars tend to be spectacular movies involving spacecraft or aliens or mutants or some sort of science fiction element. And as a result of that, there's often a need to have very spectacular backgrounds, effects, and other things that visually and psychologically appeal to people. And the art of creating those effects is rather different from anything that's been done previously. We incorporate elements of practical props, items that are physical devices, and we also incorporate elements of computer-generated graphics, but we include as well the elements of stunts and movements that are physically very difficult, if not impossible, to perform in real life without somebody being injured or killed. And this is a developing art that has reached a point where they've gotten more outrageous and more spectacular. And how this is done without literally killing somebody is a subject of question. And we're going to address that by talking to somebody who makes their living actually setting up and performing these stunts. So this is going to be an interesting show that has some elements of art and science and entertainment all blended together. So if you think of your favorite movie in recent times and you look at all the action in it, there are really two distinct portions in many movies, and one is the part that shows the dialogue and the personal interactions between the characters, and then the other part is the one that shows all of the action scenes and all of the spectaculars, the explosions, the chases, the gymnastics. Now, something that a lot of people aren't familiar with is the fact that normally a movie is broken into essentially two different production companies. They have a first unit and a second unit. And the first unit is usually a director who handles the most close-ups with the stars, their interactions, and the day-to-day happenings that go on in the movie. And that doesn't eliminate any stunts or special effects. There are sure to be some. But the second unit is the one that handles all of the stunts and particularly things like explosions and chase scenes and interactions that include gymnastics and flying and falling. So you really have two companies working together to make one movie, a first unit with a first unit director and a second unit with a second unit director. And most of the scenes with your stars are going to be first unit scenes. The ones on the second unit are those that are the transitions between the stars and their doubles and the stunts that are performed and that sort of activity. So when you think about it, you really have two different companies making a movie if it's any one of the large special effects blockbusters or spectaculars. Now, of course, the focus of this program is the science and technology behind doing these things. And one of the things that many listeners would be very interested to discover is that there are many free software packages you can download that give you the ability to do much of these things on your home computer with a little bit of practice, and you can create the audio and the visuals and the modeling and everything using nothing more than your laptop. Of course, it takes a fair degree of practice and talent to be able to get started. But there is much you can do that can, if not rival, at least imitate what's done by many of the big movie studios. Now, as you can imagine, it takes a lot to make a movie, much more than just a script and a good cast. You have to understand what elements in the movie are going to reflect reality and which ones are going to reflect an imaginary world. And to that end, there are a lot of things that you have to generate besides your costumes and your props and your settings. Now, in the times past, a lot of movie stunts were done very easily. They were called practical stunts, and these are the ones where you use real-world objects and you actually fall or tumble or wreck a car. And in practical stunts, there are certain inherent physical dangers. And so a lot is done to try and remove that danger as much as possible and yet keep the stunt as convincing as it can be. And the other issue is that a lot of times computer-generated images, or CGI, tend to be the way to do some of the stunts. You can't do it any other way. For instance, if somebody's walking down a path of stones in a sea of lava, in real life, you actually couldn't do that because the heat radiating from the lava would quite likely kill you, and the gas from it would too. But we often see scenes in the movies where somebody goes strolling along some stones in the middle of a flow of lava. And that's usually done by combining computer-generated imagery and green screen effects. The most familiar you're going to be with green screen is where you see, and sometimes it's blue, they usually use green or blue as a color. They used to call it chroma keying, and whenever you see somebody doing the weather on the news, what you're actually seeing is they're standing in front of a colored screen, usually green or blue, and they're acting in front of this screen, and then digitally they've overlaid a background, such as the weather map. Now, in the movies, this is a much more refined art, and you can do it so smoothly that there's literally no transition visible to the eye. It looks like you're actually there. The effect has gotten so good that you place actors, actresses, hardware, and everything in locations that sometimes don't even exist. So in many cases, a practical stunt can be a hybrid, because computer-generated imagery, as good as it is, often is not quite convincing. We've still got some advancements to do in the technology before it can completely replace practical stunts. So in the past, you might have an actor or a stunt person in a vehicle, let's say, and they're going to wreck the vehicle, and they may roll it or smash it into a wall or something. But in today's technology, we try, in many cases, to replace as much of the danger with a computer-generated image, as mentioned earlier. And some of that can be done very convincingly because the modeling methods and the rendering methods have gotten very, very good of producing an object that looks and acts as if it's the real thing. So often enough, the stunt performer or actor will be strapped into a part of a car or a frame of a car that has the doors and hood and the steering wheel and everything in place, and that will be thrown or manipulated in some way while they're in it, and they will be surrounded by green screen elements that will then be replaced with the scenery, the wreckage, whatever action is necessary to make it appear real. In many cases, this is quite sufficient. Sometimes, however, you actually have to smash a car with somebody in it. But there are many other elements as well, and one of them goes back to movie monsters. Many people are familiar with the old movies that were made with stop-motion photography, where somebody would build a miniature scale model of a monster, and then they would animate it by changing it a little bit, snapping a frame of film, and changing it a little and snapping a frame again, kind of like an animated cartoon or a claymation. This sort of thing has almost entirely vanished now because it has become so easy to generate not a physical armature with clay or fur or scales on it, but instead to create a computer graphic model. So computer animation has contributed greatly to the ability to insert realistic-looking and acting monsters, creatures, or persons into a film, and many people were familiar with the Lord of the Rings trilogy and the Gollum character. Here you had a fellow who was in a white suit with dots or markers all over it, and as he acted, the positions of the dots were recorded by a computer and used as reference points upon which to overlay a digital armature, a model that didn't actually exist. And the result was extremely convincing. It looked genuine, and the character fit into the scenes as if he were actually there and performing. So how do you go about creating a convincing monster? And one of the best sources of material is biology itself. There are many instances where filmmakers will have a team that will take live animals or creatures, and they will film them and digitize those models. And in some instances, they will actually put reference markers or dots on the creature and use the computer and have the computer record the movements of those points. Now, why is this important? Well, this is something called motion capture. You're able to digitally analyze how the expressions, the movements of the limbs, and everything occur, and represent it in the computer as a formula or a model. And we've talked a lot about modeling on previous shows. We create a digital model from this movement, and the motion capture becomes the guide for making realistic and, movements that actually follow physics and look convincing to the eye. So some people will actually put on a white suit with the dots and the reference points on it, and they'll crawl around on the floor, and they'll act out the part. And then later, the computer will use those reference dots and take the movement of a large lizard or a bear or a tiger and map it over those points so that the movement acts out exactly as you would if you were actually a tiger playing the part. So in essence, you create a digital model of whatever you wish the creature to be, and that's the kinetics of the model, how it can move, the shape of the model, the color, the texture, reflections. But then you make a second model that's attached to it, and it is the movement model. This is an abstract model. It doesn't have any physical components, but it is the model of how the joints will move and how they move realistically. So we have different layers of models that perform to create the end result. And when you add to that the model of sound that it can generate, we can actually take a voice and morph it through a digital filtering model that makes it sound as if it would be created by that animal. Now, one of the things that a lot of people haven't really thought about is, what exactly is it that we are selling when we hire an actor? When an actor goes for a job, what is it that they represent that we want in our movie? I mean, when you hire an actor, is it their looks or their build? In many cases it is. Is it their movements? Well, yeah, a lot of times it's that as well. It's the way they make their expressions, the sound of their voice. Maybe it's the methods that they use to act, or the interpretation of the part. In short, we can find people who sound like people and look like people and even move and act like people, but it isn't that person. And when you hire an actor or an actress for a specific part, you're trying to create, let's call it a nonverbal message, a sensory experience. And all of these things come together to make that actor or actress who they are. And they interpret a role in a specific way. When we get better digital models, we get models that look like, sound like, and move like that person. But how that model will act, how that synthetic person will act, is still the question. You need some sort of artificial intelligence to make the model actor act like the actual actor. Otherwise, you're going to spend an awful lot of time and effort programming it to do the parts that you want it to do. So, for the moment, we still depend on the talents of real live actors and actresses. But that will be changing pretty soon from the looks of things. The industry is rapidly advancing. And actors and actresses in the past often would take on roles on, let's say, voice talent. They would do voiceovers for things. And we would hear their work on television commercials or in little blurbs that happened in things. Could be anything, a soundbite in something, sometimes in cartoons. But what we see now is that has morphed quite a bit as well. Jobs that actors and actresses would often take on the side have grown very differently due to the video game market. In many cases, video game companies or the producers of games will hire voice talent or acting talent because they need the look and the feel and the action of that person. So they will outfit them for motion capture, and they will film them and digitize them and use them often as characters in a game or to make announcements or voiceovers for the game. So video games have affected the movie-making industry in many ways, and one of the greatest things that's rooted firmly in both of them at this time is motion capture. Early on for digital models in video games, motion capture was the thing to make it appear as realistic as possible. But that has been expanded, amazingly, into the film industry. So motion capture has become really one of the fundamental tools used to make automatic generation of synthetic characters that act and look the way you want them to. So computer technology is one of the largest factors in movie making these days, and the influences it has had are far-reaching. We see computers used to create and edit the sounds, to create and edit the models of the backgrounds and the landscapes, to animate things that don't even exist, to do the editing of the video, to perform the addition or alteration or removal of elements or characters, and to even create characters from scratch. So where is it all going? Well, we're going to talk to some people who perform practical stunts, real-world things, and how their take is on the additions of technology to our movie-making industry here. And this is Talk Universe. Now, our guest tonight is a veteran Hollywood stunt coordinator, actor, and producer, James Churchman. And if you look on the Internet Movie Database, even there he has 79 credits stretching all the way back to 1992 for an amazing array of movies and television productions, including Terminator 5, Genesis, the Man of Steel, the Jeepers Creepers movie, Pineapple Express. Just recently completed the Doctor Strange movie filmed in London. He did X-Men Apocalypse, X-Men Last Stand, and numerous movies. It would be impossible to describe them all. So tonight we have Jim Churchman on the show, and Jim, welcome to the show.
Hey, Charles. Thank you.
How long have you been doing work in the movies anyway?
I started in 92.
And you've done a number of them since then. I looked at Internet Movie Database. It shows 79 credits going back that far. That's pretty amazing. That's a lot of movies and television.
Yeah, I was happy when I passed 50, but I guess I'm kind of beyond 50 now.
By a considerable number, yes. So what sort of work do you normally do in the movies?
Well, these days I do a lot of stunt coordinating, typically with a heavy emphasis on wire work or vehicular work.
Right. So that would include automobile crashes and stunts of that sort as well, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Do you work mostly? Do you work mostly with automobiles or motorcycles, or do you have a preference?
Well, I came up with a motorcycle background, so it's kind of my passion. But I got to admit, there's not many things that are more fun than crashing a car.
Intentionally.
Yeah, exactly.
Have you seen a big increase in technology in the movies in the time you've been working on them?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one change is, from shooting on film, 35 millimeter film, to shooting digitally. That's been a big change in technology. And then that seems to have bolstered the CGI capabilities. That's just what we do these days. Is we're always working with a visual effects team to combine our talents and hopefully come up with newer, better stuff.
So the move from film to video to digital has been a really improvement, a big improvement, in your opinion.
Well, no. So that is an artistic question, really, and that's a hard one. I would say fostering technology has helped, especially like I said. Now you can really see your dailies the day of almost sometimes these days. Of course, I'm getting a phone call while we're having an interview, but I'll decline it for now. Yeah, I'd say that, going to digital photography has certainly sped up the post-production process and made room for, a lot more enhancement.
So I imagine, you can see what's happening almost immediately, and if you need to change something or update something, or you've got it.
Yeah, and even think about like color corrections and stuff like that, where when you're working with film, you had the negative you had to work on. Here it's just keystroke.
Sure, I know that saves a lot of time and money. So
yeah.
What would you say is the technology you use the most in your work?
Well, in my work, for me personally, I mean, it's been wire work, wire flying. So I've early on developed some computerized winches, which I think you're pretty familiar with, Charles.
Right.
And they have been a key in keeping up with, the demands of today's movies. And what's kept us in the game is that the marriage point between physical photography and CG takeover, we push it a little bit back towards them. So we have I like to do as much real photography as we can, and then then they can take over when it makes sense.
Right.
Versus they've made leaps and bounds in the CG world. Obviously, everybody knows that. But I can still see when a character is completely generated, the movement is very apparent to me. Maybe that's because it's what I do, but I think the audience sees it too. And I think, by, doing everything we can to do as much real to start with, to give the CGI guys as much information as they can, have. So it gives them a better starting point for their work, and I think it makes the marriage better.
Yeah, I think I would agree. And, there's so many things that we do very, very well in the real world and not so well in the computer world. And so having as much of a foundation in reality as you can makes any scene you shoot much, much more convincing. And I would completely agree with that thought. What would you say is your most memorable stunt?
Well, we've got several. There's the Quicksilver stuff in the last two X-Men,
right.
The kitchen scene and the mansion explosion. I think in scope, the landing scene in Iron Man 3, where I was flying 14 people holding hands and landing them in the water as Iron Man's flying them down, letting them go into water. And to do that practically, it felt like quite an accomplishment.
I imagine so. You won an award for that, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. That's true.
Yeah, I think that was definitely one of the most visually striking scenes in the movie, having so many people in the air at once and no visible means of support other than a fellow flying in an outfit. That's, I imagine it took a lot of logistics to get that clean.
Yeah, it did. We had a lot of ideas on how to accomplish it, and that was one of those that turned out, simple was better. And so our setup on that was, for one person, was very simple. And of course, it was compounded to do 14 at the same time. But it was a very simple approach, and it was effective. I think it worked well.
Fantastic. Do you think that computer graphics is going to replace some or all of what you're doing presently?
I think that will exist. I don't think that demographic is for everybody. You know what I mean? So I think there'll always be practical photography as well. So, but certainly the amount that we do practically is going to be a constant tug of war, and we're going to lose a little more and a little more. But at some point, do you want to watch a completely generated movie? What separates that from a cartoon? Or do you want to watch, a movie with human elements in it and that kind of emotion? So I think at least for the rest of my career, I'll be okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I still see a big divide in the digital generated stuff and the real stuff. Again, it's as if they don't quite get the physics or the optics right or something. And I know that even with motion capture and other technologies, it's getting better. But I personally don't see the dividing line coming for maybe another 5 years. And that's just an opinion. But still, it's looking awfully good. If you had a dream stunt, what would it be?
Oh, I don't know. We kind of just did that.
Yeah, tell me about that if you could.
Yeah, so my friend Luke jumped out of an airplane, 25,000 feet, so almost 4.5 miles, with no parachute, and landed in a rig that we built. And that was something I'd been thinking of since the 90s, and was happy to get the opportunity to create that. It was a pretty epic day.
I saw some of the hardware involved in that. I wasn't present for the actual event, but it was an extremely impressive thing to see, and I know it had a lot of people really excited when it happened. And I can only imagine what somebody would want to do next after something like that. Go suborbital.
Yeah, I know. I hear you. That's the thing. How do you top that? And I think the real answer is you don't top it. You just slide sideways and do something comparable that still keeps your interest and interest of the population. So we got a couple things that we're considering and throwing some ideas around. We'll see what the future brings. It should be interesting.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I do appreciate you having some time to spend with us on the show, and it's been very informative and a lot of fun. And I've enjoyed working with you, and I'm looking forward to a lot more in the future.
Charles, it's always a pleasure to have you, and you're obviously a wealth of knowledge to have around. You're a great part of the team, And it's just fun having you around. So thank you.
Thank you, Jim. It's been a real honor. Okay, thank you, and we'll try to interview you again sometime in another show.
All right, thank you.
Okay. So those were some pretty interesting comments about the changes in the technology, and what I found most interesting was the comment on film. Many movies do look better for some reason. I guess it's a psychological thing when shot on 35 millimeter film. But as Jim Churchman pointed out, when you're shooting on film, there are things that take time to process and you won't know until after the film was developed and you've got your print. Whereas if you're using digital methods, you can see almost immediately what your shot looked like, and if something needs to be changed, it can be done right away. If you miss an angle or the lighting is bad or something along those lines, digital technologies allow you to do that work and fix that in just a matter of minutes, instead of having to wait for the film to go to the lab and then come back and review. But you don't have the same artistic look and feel with digital methods as you do with traditional film. Now, maybe a filter could be written that would transform the image so it looks more like a film image, and I'm pretty sure that could be done. But his point is definitely valid. There are some changes in the technology that change your artistic means and not just the technical means. It's also true we've all seen movies with computer-generated monsters and effects and characters, and they just don't look right. And it's because even though the graphics can be quite good, if the movement or its execution isn't proper, we know, psychologically, we look at it and we know it just doesn't look right. So there are some of those things that have a ways to go before all of the CGI characters are working properly and all the effects are working properly. But until that day, stunt coordinators and special effects people will have to work together to produce the realistic-looking things that we see today. And Jim has definitely done an awful lot of that work. What he was mentioning with the winches is many of the effects that involve people flying or doing acrobatics or falling from an altitude safely are done with a wire. And actually, it's a type of a cord or a filament. And what it does is supports them in midair as they fly through their path or as they go through an acrobatic routine. And he's developed and built a set of computer-controlled winches that does that. So a path is set, and the computer then duplicates that path at the push of a button. So the actor or actress can, or even a camera can be flown for that matter, or some other hardware. So they can repeat this movement a few times during their practice to get it right, and then when the day comes, when the call for action occurs and the cue is given, they go through their movements smoothly under computer control and can duplicate it as many times as necessary to get the shot right. And this is a real advancement. There are a couple of companies doing that, but to my knowledge, he's got really a very flexible system. And I've had the great privilege of working with him on the last couple of movies, the X-Men Apocalypse movie, which we filmed in Montreal last year, and the Doctor Strange movie, which was filmed from the end of last year to the beginning of this year. And those were both a regular blast to work on. I really had a lot of fun. And it's the sort of thing that it's kind of addictive to see the execution of a program that moves somebody through the air, flies them around, and does something just spectacular with them. Now, Jim's reference to the fall from 25,000 feet was, of course, the Luke Aikens skydive without a parachute that took place a couple of months ago, where he fell successfully with 3 helpers and an oxygen mask, and as he reached the proper altitude, they took the mask, and he, if you look at the video, you'll see him do a practice rollover a couple of times. He skydived into a catcher net on the ground, a system that Jim put together. And it's pretty amazing to think that somebody can fall from 4.5 miles up without a parachute and make a safe landing. And that's exactly what he did, a project that he's had in mind since the 90s, and successfully carried it out. That was one of his dream projects. What a fantastic achievement. But also imagine being able to place a camera in a rig that flies it around to any viewpoint, any altitude, or any path on command. And this is one of the things that Jim has brought to the industry very clearly. So computing has actually reached just about every corner of filmmaking and television production. and we'll be back after the break. You're listening to Talk Universe. One of the most fascinating things that I observed during the production of a couple of movies that I'd worked on is the replacement of the storyboard. In times past, we would know that whenever you laid out your story, the simplest way to do it was literally to sketch each scene out, some of the actions, some of the camera angles, what you expected to see in the form of a sort of rough cartoon. And your storyboard would be posted like a timeline, and you would use your script or your screenplay as a basis for laying out your storyboard in sections. Now, one of the most interesting things I'd heard years ago was when Arthur C. Clarke was asked to write a screenplay for 2001: A Space Odyssey, and he said, I don't know how to write a screenplay. He was told, just write 90 one-minute scenes. In summary, that's actually very good advice, and when you consider laying out a storyboard, you simply break your script or your screenplay down into a series of very short scenes, and you cartoon each of them. So you basically outline where everybody's going to stand, what they're going to look at, what they're going to be doing. And all of this is done in some very basic sketches. Now, what I saw instead was we would have pre-visuals every morning when we got to work. And the pre-visual is essentially a digital cartoon of the movie. In other words, before the movie is made, there is, in essence, a digital cartoon of the movie made. And instead of the traditional storyboard, you have screenshots from that or a digital model on the computer. And so you have a whole series of labeled, numbered, and lettered scenes from each movie, and each one is a little short blurb, might be 10 seconds, 3 seconds, 30 seconds, and you follow that to the letter and reproduce it with live actors and actual props and settings, and that is your storyboard that you do your movie from. I think one of the most surprising things that people find out when they get into a movie-making environment, they see what's really happening, is that the scenes are almost never filmed in order. You often will put scenes on a certain, let's say you're in a location, and you have 3 different scenes out of the movie that are shot there, but at different times. Well, what you will do is you will film all of them at the time you're at that location. You'll just change your costumes to match the time flow of the movie. So you might have a scene at the beginning of the movie and one in the middle of the movie that are both in Boston, and you're actually in Miami. And when you go to Boston to shoot, if you go on location at all, you will shoot both of those scenes at the same time, but you just change your wardrobe to match the different times that you're there. And often it's perfectly normal to shoot scenes from the end of the movie before the beginning of the movie is shot. Because after all those scenes are filmed and, so to speak, in the can, they can be rearranged in any way you want and spliced together to make the actual finished movie. Now, this shouldn't seem unusual at all, because think about it. Let's say you're building a car from scratch. You don't have to make the wheels before you make the engine. And you don't have to put the cranks on the windows before you put the upholstery on the seats. You can make all of the components in any order, and then you're free to assemble them once you're done. So if you think of the story of a movie as broken down into components, just like the parts of a vehicle or of a machine, you understand that those parts don't have to be made in a certain order. It is the order of assembly at the end, once all of the parts are completed, that really makes a difference. So the storyboard is one of those tools that takes the moment-by-moment, blow-by-blow play of the story and turns it into components, pieces, and parts. And those are the elements that are then later, after they're finished, polished, and ready to go, are fitted together to make the finished story, the movie itself. So I would say that the greatest influence on movie making in terms of science and technology at the very beginning of this would have to be computing. It would have to be the ability to get digital images rather than film, and to immediately see, a right-away turnaround. You have no delay time to speak of between shooting your scene and seeing if the scene turned out. At the end of a scene, it starts with the director yelling action and whatever cues for the events to occur in the scene, and then he yells cut. And literally, there are a dozen people in the pit watching this scene, the playback, moments later, and they can say, this camera needs to be moved over, or this fellow needs to start a little earlier, or whatever. It can be rearranged in minutes and shot again. And so the dynamics of shooting a movie are very different. They're much more fluid in terms of being able to correct a situation or improve a situation. And this is something they really didn't have with 35 millimeter film. Now, there are pluses and minuses. The artistic content was one of the big issues. But again, I think that a lot of that could be done with digital modeling and filtering. Now, something else that isn't immediately obvious is the changes in the lighting technologies. In the past, you often had to have extremely bright lights like carbon arc or something along those lines, large banks of halogen lamps, to get the sort of illumination you need. And it's true that some of those are still in use today, but LEDs, solid-state lighting, have made a huge change in how illumination is done and the type of illumination. If you were trying to simulate a scene where you had a blue sky with clouds moving overhead, and you had it simply as let's say a diffuse light source or a backdrop through a window, then you would be pretty much limited to a static painting or some gels or something along those lines. Or you'd have to go to a scene where you actually could spot a cloudy sky out the window. But with LED panels, they make a number of large panels that have dozens or hundreds of solid-state lights inside them, and they're connected to a computer, and a graphic pattern can be downloaded in them. And as a result, you can create the actual glow of a sky and the movement of white clouds over it. So now the lighting becomes also, in many cases, a set piece. It becomes a part of your backdrop. Being able to program your lighting and digital patterns also means you have opportunities to simulate events that aren't actually there. And I'll give you an example. Let's say you insert a character or a monster through computer graphics, and it has some sort of a light source with it. And it could be, the flame from a dragon, for instance, or the glow of a light sword. And how would you insert that lighting back in the actual scene? Well, in the past, you would have to actually go in and touch it up, or you'd have to have somebody in the background shining a light in a certain pattern. But when you have digital lighting technologies, you can put those light sources off camera, and they will create the illumination effects that are going to come from your model or your monster or whatever synthetic light source you put in. So if you insert a computer graphic of something that glows, like, say, a spacecraft or something, then the lighting system can actually insert the realistic lighting that would come off that object even though it's not in the scene. So digital lighting and solid-state lighting have contributed to a lot of the atmosphere or mood in a scene in exactly this way. They also use a number of older technologies to give the proper amount of lighting. For instance, in many of the large stages, there will be some blue silk structure in the high overhead, and your light source will be inside, and by controlling its illumination level and the color of the silk, you can give a soft background sky glow. This can be done for sunset lighting or for standard blue sky lighting or whatever you'd like. In the case where you need something very specific, it can be tailored on LEDs, and it becomes an integral part of the atmosphere and the lighting of the scene. Now, there's one aspect that I haven't even talked about yet, and it's this. Many times, you have to create not a character or a light effect, but an environment. When you're creating an environment, it used to be that you would go to a location and you'd put some set props, dressings in, make it look like some science fiction or fantasy scene, or some place that didn't exist, or maybe a knockoff of a place that does exist, but you just can't go there. And whatever you do, you would dress a real location to look like the place you were trying to film in. And this had pluses and minuses. It's still, largely used today because many times it gives you a simple and very realistic solution to the issue of generating a scene. You can go somewhere in the Utah desert and set up some Stone Age culture there, and the backdrop is perfect in many respects. But sometimes you have to create a scene for a place that doesn't exist. And how do you blend that into reality? Remember, when your camera is moving around, if you have a backdrop painted on a wall, it's going to lose its realism very, very quickly. You need to have physical presence, or at least you have to have something that convinces you that it's physically present. Here comes digital modeling. In the same manner that many of the scenery in, let's say, cityscapes that don't exist or planets that don't exist, these things are created in video games all the time. So what happens when you introduce the technology that allows you to create these scenes in a very realistic manner and do it on the fly? What you can do is you bring in surveying equipment, such as a surveyor's transit or a theodolite, and you nail down reference points on the portion of the scene that is real. Then, all around it, you wrap blue screen, or green screen in this case. And the film industry uses green almost exclusively for a number of reasons. So you wrap your scene in a green screen, might be a soundstage, and you have your real set pieces in the middle where your action will occur. And then wrapped around it, on the surveyor transit reference points, you have a digital model. Now, the model isn't actually there, but you have a special camera with a split screen, and one screen shows exactly what the camera sees, actors and props in a green screen. The other screen overlays the digital fake reality onto the scene. So everywhere the green screen is, it overlays it with your digital model. And before the scene is actually filmed, you can look into this magical window into the green screen area and have it replaced with your synthetic world. So as the camera pans around to different shots, the digital information is stored in the scene, and later the computers stitch in the fake reality to displace it. And it puts you in scenes that cannot possibly exist. It's possible to put actual cities that do exist in there as well if you take 3D footage and modeling of it in advance. So now we have the capability to literally create a window into another reality and place the actors and the props in that alternate reality. This is one of the most powerful tools in cinema today, the ability to create a synthetic world and place somebody in it. And this is how it's done. So now you have the ability to look in your camera, see the actual scene, and overlaid on it or side by side with it, you can see what the finished product will look like even as you're filming. And if you move the camera around, aim it in different viewpoints, the digital fake world moves with it, so that in real time, it creates the illusion of being there. What an amazing technology this is. And it's something that's coming more and more to the virtual reality games that are emerging on the scene today. There are elements of movie making that actually inspire real advances in technology and real gadgets to be built and developed. An excellent example is one of the early James Bond movies back in the 60s, Thunderball. In the movie, they needed the ability for skin divers to get around underwater very easily, and they invented underwater propeller-guided sleds or carriers. They were battery-powered. At the time, no such thing existed, but now it is actually an industry. They make underwater vehicles that you ride exactly as they did in that 1960s movie. Here's a technical innovation that came from a fiction. Another example, many are familiar with the movie Aliens, in which there is a forklift suit that the wearer puts on and gains the ability to move hundreds of pounds or thousands of pounds around effortlessly. Actual companies were inspired to build real forklift exoskeletons. They've been used in industry and even in the military. So here's another idea that was put together by movie prop and stunt people and ended up becoming an actual technology that we're using in the world today. So never forget that if you have a good idea, something good enough to inspire somebody to make an interesting and convincing movie about it, there's a good possibility that some of those technologies will become real. You'll remember the movie Minority Report, where they used gestures to tell the computer what they wanted to do and what commands were being input. This is now a real technology today, and many of those movies that supported this sort of, haptic interface where you simply move your hands like sign language, and the computer interprets it and uses it as commands. This is something that we have brought to reality from the world of fantasy. Now, one more note on the digital versus film issue, and this is an important one. This is something that a lot of people don't consider. Film is bulky and fragile, and it breaks down over time, and it's flammable, and the color degrades, and it does not give you proper long-term storage of your movie. But by moving to digital, we've gained an entirely new method of not only distributing, but storing our movies. We have access to the raw material, which does not degrade over time, and at any point in the future can be used to show the movie exactly as we intended it. And there are new storage technologies that use crystalline memory and lasers that can literally store millions of movies on a single 2-centimeter disc for a period of 1 billion years or more. That brings real permanence to the creations of humanity and our arts. This is Talk Universe. I mentioned earlier that I was going to list a number of tools that would allow you to do the sorts of editing and creating that you see in many movies today. And I'm going to do that right now. One of the first tools you need for movie making, obviously, is something to capture your video. And there are a number of very decent cameras that can do it. Even cell phones today have amazing resolution and storage capability. So once you have a method of recording your video or capturing your video, you need somewhere to store it, and a good large hard drive on your computer can do that. But how do you manipulate it? There are a number of free tools that allow you to edit your video in pretty much any way you want. And I've got a number of these tools on my machine that I've downloaded, and I use them all the time. One of my favorites is called Virtual Dub. It is a software video editing program that allows you to, well, for instance, splice scenes together, move them around, edit them. But it also gives you the capability of generating animations. So if you have some modeling software that generates the frames one after another, or even if you hand sketch them and snap them on your digital camera and store them in the computer, it allows you to splice those frames together and create animations or cartoons very easily. So Virtual Dub is the first tool I'll recommend, and it can be located at this website. Just go to www.virtualdub.org, and they have 32 and 64-bit versions that allow you to do all sorts of frame manipulation as well. Filters, interlacing, video effects. So Virtual Dub is the first tool I recommend. That's the one you're going to use to do a lot of things like editing your movie and putting frames together. Of course, a lot of people are familiar with Windows Movie Maker, and that's not a bad tool, and it gives you a lot of flexibility. It has a lot of preset elements in it that are easy to work with. But it doesn't have all the flexibility that you'd really like. However, it's not a bad place to start if you're making videos for a podcast or something along those lines, and you certainly could use it to make movies. Now, if you want to create graphics, and it could be any sort of graphics, it could be titling for labeling your scenes or your movies, or it could be solid objects, devices that you have around you like table lamps, chairs, and that sort of thing. You can create virtual models of them any number of ways, and one of my favorite programs is called POVRay. POV stands for Persistence of Vision, and POVRay.org has versions that run on single and multiprocessor machines, and it's an extremely well-developed program. And you're going to learn a lot about describing things mathematically when you start playing with this program, but it's a real delight once you get it going. So download POVRay and have a look at it, and there are plenty of examples with the software. In this program, you can create environments, houses, buildings, objects, characters. It just depends on how intensely you're going to devote yourself to the software and what you need. There are other modeling programs that allow you to create 3D models, virtual worlds, just about anything you can imagine. And one of my favorites is Blender. Now, this is just like the blender you have in your kitchen. Blender.org is the place to locate it. It doesn't cost anything. Although I have to say, I do recommend making a small donation to the people who developed all this free software, because they've put countless hours of effort into getting it right. And I'll tell you, they're really professional tools. So Blender is an excellent way to go, and it gives you a lot of environments, lighting, shadows, textures, the ability to create very complex organic forms, including people and characters, and there are a lot of templates available that you can work from. So you can create your creatures or your characters of any sort, and you can animate them as well, because it has a full range of tools for animating these things. So Blender is another very good program. Suppose you feel the need to create a video game, and keep in mind that you can create a video game environment and use it to create much of the scenes, action, and structure of a movie. There's nothing wrong with doing that, and there's some very good programs to do that. My favorite is Unreal Engine 4, which is a video game producing engine, of all things, yet you can make movies in it very easily. It's interesting how these things develop. The Unreal Engine was the outgrowth of a company that made video games, and many people are now going back and taking older games, retro games, and reimagining them in the Unreal Engine and producing cinematic quality trailers for their work. So here you have tools that will manipulate your audio and allow you to create and edit it. And by the way, the program that I use, and I think just everybody does for audio work, is Audacity. And it is also a free download, but once again, I do recommend supporting the people who create these things. And if you want to download it, you go to audacityteam.org, and you can download the program for your machine there, and they're up to version 2.1.2, and that came out just January of this year. It is an amazing and very, very functional program, and in fact, it's become the de facto standard for anybody who does audio editing. Now, there are a number of tools that also allow you to do green screen effects, for instance, to set your webcam up, or any camera, basically, and to have a green backdrop behind you, and to place any sort of artwork or computer-generated world in its place, so you appear to be moving around in that background. One of my favorites that I found is called Sparko Cam, and it's a downloaded utility that you have to buy it, but it allows you to set your webcam or any sort of camera you have so that it gives you green screen capability or chroma key capability. And so with the Sparko Cam utility, and I think it runs around $30 or $35, you can actually place live actors in your synthetic scenes. So here you have the ability to seamlessly splice together some of your virtual work with your real-world acting talent. So this is a whole suite of tools that you have. You have your audio handled. You have your generation of imaginary elements, props, scenery, tools. You have character modeling and animation, titling, editing. That pretty much covers a lot of what you need. What you don't have on hand is, well, necessarily talent until you begin working with it and you discover just what you're good at. And I think that everybody has talent. In fact, I'm sure of it. Everybody that I've met has contributed something to my life one way or another. So I know that many people after hearing this will go, well, I don't know if I'm really interested in doing it. But show this to your kids, show it to your friends. Somebody will go, hey, this is a tool I need to solve a problem I have. Doesn't mean they're going to be making movies or getting into cinema, but you never know. Now, for our Singularity Watch, we're going to cover a couple of very interesting things here. They are often talking about the question of whether machines can be conscious, and they have a new Turing test that is being designed to see if a machine is actually thinking. Now, Turing, Alan Matheson Turing, was a fellow who was instrumental in World War II in building the Enigma code-breaking machine, and he has a fascinating story to his life, and if you have an opportunity to see the movie, which is The Imitation Game, with Benedict Cumberbatch, I recommend it highly. I give it 5 stars, no question about it. Turing defined the Turing test, the ability to see if a machine was thinking, in a very simple way. You would basically have a room in which you could communicate with a human being, or you could communicate with a program, but you wouldn't know which. And based on the questions that you posed and the answers that were returned, you were to make a decision. And if the machine could fool you into thinking it was human, it basically would have passed the test and be thinking. Now, this is a very simple way of describing it. But in reality, we have a new Turing test that allows a machine to, for instance, look at an image and figure out what the image implies. What is going on in this picture? There's a story being told. And if the machine can figure those elements out, we might believe that it is capable of thinking. So there is a researcher, and a pair of researchers actually, the name of Christopher Koch and Giulio Tononi, and they're working on this new Turing test to see if we can actually prove whether a machine is or is not conscious. They do believe it's possible, and that's one of the projects that is going on right now, which was reported in the IEEE Spectrum just recently. For me, I think that the question of machine intelligence is actually a very, very important one, because we are on the verge of having non-human intelligences make major decisions in our lives. So it's very important for us to understand if a machine that's deciding what's going to make our lives different is actually capable of comprehending what their decisions mean. But one of the lessons I took away after seeing the Turing movie, and I'm kind of off the Singularity Watch, to be honest here, is the story showed me how humanity constantly destroys its most valuable resource, that of intelligence and thought and creation. We need to do something about this because we're cutting our roots out from under us. Now, I do have a book recommendation, and it's a very simple one, and it is in the field of movie making. However, it isn't about the visuals or any of those other things. The book is Sound Technology and the American Cinema, and it isn't a new book. It was published in August of 2000, and it's written by James Lastra. And what it does is it covers essentially photography, phonography, and cinema, and how they've come together since the 19th century, how the technologies have changed in them. Because in any movie, no matter how badly it's filmed, sometimes, even with the worst of actors and the worst of script, the movie's made by its music, its sound. So this is a very important element, something that we often ignore. The quality of sound in a production can actually be one of the most important and influential parts of that production. So it's very important to know its history and how it's come to be what it is today. And I recommend this book. It's available on Amazon. Sound Technology and the American Cinema by James Lastra, published in 2000. Please have a look at it, and I think you'll learn a lot. My final note is actually very simple. We do a lot of things in fiction or in jest or in the creative spirit that end up making our lives very different. Sometimes it's a fictional device that ends up in a movie and we end up inventing the actual device. Sometimes it's simply a concept that emerges from a story that touches our hearts or makes us think a little differently. One of the things that I've learned is that no matter how bad the economy is, how bad times are, luxuries always travel well, and entertainment is always something that people want. Entertainment is fundamentally a part of our souls. It is something that makes us more than the animal. The ability to give a story, to tell a story, to relate a viewpoint, or to create a scene that nobody has ever imagined, to put together something that transports you in a way that nothing in the physical world does. This is what entertainment and movies in particular are all about. I think that this is an important element in not only telling the stories, but also documenting how we view the stories. If we look at how movies were made a century ago, and we see their elements and what was in them and how they presented the story, we see something very different in the psychology of the people who made those movies and the ones we do today. There is a history written not just in the movies themselves, but in their production and their values, something that is often overlooked as well. So let's never underestimate the power of communication, no matter what the medium is. We carry a message in all of our lives, and many of us are the living examples of some message that we wish the world to see. We need to learn not only how to send our message to others, but how to see the message that others are giving to us. So imagine that you're a visitor from another world and you come here for the first time and you see our civilization and you see our entertainment and you see our world. You see how we act to each other and all the things that we're doing. Could you possibly explain it to them in 3 sentences, for instance? How would we explain the fact that much of what we do is utterly insane? Now, you may think that this is an unlikely scenario, that aliens aren't going to show up and start judging us. But you know what? Those AIs are on the way. And if it comes down to explaining your decisions, how you choose what you do, what you eat, what you wear, where you go, what you buy, encapsulating your life in a simple explanation, what is good, what is evil, might be a very, very tough thing to do. In fact, I think it's going to be the toughest thing that any of us ever have to do. Entertainment tells us a lot about our mindset and the backdrop of our civilization and the things that we consider acceptable or unacceptable. In the final analysis, that's what we have to face. We'll learn a lot from our movies and the things that we watch and we listen to. They set a backdrop again for who and what we are and how we perceive much. And I suppose the best way to summarize it is, no matter what technologies we use for producing our entertainment, no matter how sophisticated it gets, in the end, what do we choose to watch? What do we choose to fill our minds with? This is a very important question, because we can see the world through one set of glasses or another. And I've often heard the phrase very succinctly put, The optimist thinks we live in the best of all possible worlds, while the pessimist fears that this is so. Decide what we're going to be. Are you an optimist or a pessimist or a pragmatist? This is Talk Universe. I'm Sir Charles Schultz.